Hi guys, today's lesson is called God's Love in Action, and our sticky statement is compassion is God's love in action. For those of you who are not homeschooled, do any of you walk to school? If you do, raise your hand. I can't see it, but you know. What is your path to school like? Rocky, smooth, uphill both ways? Do you wear shoes when you walk to school? Whether you walk to school or not, what do you think it would be like to walk barefoot to school every day? If you had to walk barefoot to school, what do you think it would be like on a cold, rainy day? What if you had to walk on hot, dusty, or rocky paths? What if it was snowing? Did you know that it has been estimated that there are 3 million children around the world who do not have shoes? If they walk to school, they not only walk to school in conditions similar to these, but they also walk every day without shoes. Just to be clear, it's not that they chose to go barefoot. They actually do not own a single pair of shoes. What feelings or thoughts do you have when you hear that 3 million children don't have shoes? You might feel sad, or you might want to donate shoes to the children that don't have any. When you want to help someone who is having a difficult time, it is called compassion. Compassion is caring about someone enough to do something to help them. God is compassionate, and He calls us to show compassion. When we show compassion for others, we are actually demonstrating the love of God. Compassion is God's love in action. Today's lesson is the third lesson of a 4-part series called Wonder Women. Each of the lessons in this series will highlight women of the Bible. From each of these women, we will learn a valuable lesson for life. Today, we are going to learn from a nameless young girl who had an attitude of compassion. Although we don't know her name, we know her story because she showed compassion to a man who had a horrible disease. We will begin our lesson today in 2 Kings chapter 5. Let's meet the man with the horrible disease. I'm going to read 2 Kings 5:1. Reads, Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. Naaman was a successful military commander for the king of Syria. However, he had a big problem. He had leprosy. During Bible times, leprosy was a very contagious and deadly disease. If someone had leprosy, they were considered unclean. More often than not, they were avoided by their family and neighbors and banished from their community. This was not a 14-day quarantine type of disease. It was not a when you get better, you can come back home type of disease. Leprosy for most people was a death sentence that began by being isolated from contact with everyone except other people who had leprosy. How would you feel if you had an illness and were sent away to live totally alone? How would you feel if you knew that you were probably not going to get better and you would never be able to be around anyone in your family again? Let's keep reading. I'm going to read 2 Kings 5, verse 2. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. Back then, when armies conquered cities, they would take people from the city captive and make them servants. The Syrian army had raided the nation of Israel and taken this young girl captive. This young girl, probably not much older than some of you, had been captured and taken back to Naaman's house and forced to be a servant for Naaman's wife. Let's read the next verse. And she said unto her mistress, Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover of his leprosy. While she was serving the wife of Naaman, this young girl found out that the husband of the lady she served had leprosy. So she did what anyone would do. She laughed in her face and said, It serves him right. He shouldn't raid other people's land and take people captive. Is that what happened? No, actually, the unthinkable happened. We don't even know this young girl's name, but she knew the one true God and how God used prophets to bring healing. She told Naaman's wife that if Naaman would go see the prophet of God named Elisha, he could be healed. Wait, what? This young girl, who had been taken from her home and forced to be a servant, showed compassion for the man whose army took her captive. Do you think it was an easy decision for her to show compassion to someone who took her from her family, from her community, and made her a servant? Probably not. The girl could have developed an attitude of anger and bitterness because of what happened to her. Instead, she chose to show compassion. She chose to put God's love in action. Naaman went to his boss, the king of Syria, and requested to go see Elisha. The king of Syria sent Naaman to the king of Israel with a letter and gifts. When Elisha heard of Naaman's request to be healed, he told the king of Israel to send Naaman to him. Let's read what happened next. I'm going to read 2 Kings 5, verse 9 through 10. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. Elisha did not come out to meet with Naaman. Rather, he just sent a message for him to go wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Wash 7 times? Some of you do not like when your parents tell you to wash just 1 time. Show thumbs up if you would have immediately done as Elijah instruction and washed 7 times in the Jordan River. Give me a thumbs down if you would have said no thanks and skipped the 7 river baths. Well, this message from Elisha, servant, annoyed Naaman. He became angry and refused to do as Elisha instructed. The Jordan River was a muddy, dirty river. Naaman did not want to bathe in that. Yuck. He could have washed himself in the cleaner rivers back home. Naaman was also mad that he traveled all the way and Elisha didn't even come out to talk to him himself. Instead, he sent a servant out to deliver the dip 7 times in the river message. Naaman was about to return home when some of his own servants talked some sense into him. Naaman finally did as he was instructed. He washed himself 7 times in the Jordan River. Instantly, Naaman was healed. No longer was his skin full of sores. No longer did he have the dreaded leprosy. His skin became smooth like the skin of a baby. That's amazing. Naaman was healed because a little girl showed compassion and put God's love in action. We can learn a lot from this young servant girl. Her compassion changed the life of Naaman. Remember, compassion is God's love in action. And as you might guess, Jesus is the ultimate role model for showing compassion. By reading part of the 9th chapter of the book of Matthew, we can get a great picture of the compassion that Jesus had for others. I'm going to read Matthew 9:35. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. Jesus spent his time on earth not only teaching and preaching God's love, but also meeting people's needs through healing, even those with leprosy. Let's read Matthew 9:36 to hear the heartbeat of Jesus. When he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Jesus had an attitude of compassion for those in need. He saw their needs and helped them. We can learn a lot from both the servant girl and from Jesus. The young servant girl was taken from her home. Jesus willingly left heaven. The young servant girl saw Naaman's leprosy and the effect it was having on his daily life. Jesus saw the crowds of people and how helpless they were. The young girl spoke up and shared the source of healing. Jesus shared the good news of God's love and healed the people in the crowds. The young servant girl served the one who captured her and showed compassion so he would not die. Jesus willingly served those who were his enemies by dying for them on the cross. What Jesus did on the cross was the greatest act of compassion for you and me. His death on the cross is the ultimate demonstration that compassion is God's love in action. Obviously, we're not living in biblical times, so how do these accounts play out in your life today? What does it look like for us to show others that compassion is God's love in action? For starters, we need the ability to see the needs and feelings of others. Even though you are still children, God has surrounded you with people to whom you can show compassion. The people you live with, go to school with, in your neighborhood, and those whom you attend church with are all people to whom you can demonstrate that compassion is God's love in action. Earlier, we talked about children who didn't have shoes. When we did, some of you had an urge to do something about that problem. The easiest way to show compassion is to find something that causes you to have that feeling inside of you that says, somebody needs to do something about that. When you have that feeling, it's time for you to put God's love in action. For the servant girl, she thought that someone should do something to help Naaman. So she spoke up about the prophet Elisha. Jesus saw the need for us to be saved from sin and did something so we could have a relationship with God. What is it that makes you say, someone needs to do something about that? Compassion should lead to action. If compassion is God's love in action, what does that look like? How can we put God's love in action? What can we do? Where do we start? Here are a few ways that compassion can be expressed. You might choose to use encouraging words. You might give an appropriate hug or handshake. You might offer to help someone complete a chore. You might put your arm around someone and just listen to them share their feelings. You might invite a lonely kid to sit with you and your group of friends. You might write a letter of encouragement. You might organize a fundraiser to buy shoes for those who don't have them or lunches for students who can't afford them. Sometimes you might want to be compassionate, but the situation is beyond your ability to help. If that is the case, you could talk to a grown-up to see how you might figure out a way to help. If helping is not an option, you can always pray. Since compassion is God's love in action, will you choose to have an attitude of compassion for those around you? If so, talk to God right now and make the commitment to show compassion this week when you have the chance, or make the commitment to talk to someone who can help you show compassion this week. Our lesson today gave us examples of compassion in action. Both the servant girl and Jesus have compassion, and it moved them to help those around them. Right now, we want to give each of you something that can serve as a reminder for you to have compassion for those around you. What do these shoes remind you of? Yes, they remind us of how many children there are without shoes, but they also remind you to get moving. Put God's love in action by showing compassion. When we see this shoe, we can remember to show compassion to others. Let's have an attitude of compassion for all people, but don't let your feeling of compassion stop without doing something about it. Remember, compassion is God's love in action. May we follow Jesus' example by showing compassion to others every day, who is someone you can show compassion to this week. Review questions. What word is defined as caring about someone enough to do something to help them? A, composition. B, commitment. C, compassion. C, compassion. What was the name of the military commander whose story is found in 2 Kings chapter 5? A, Naaman. B, Norman. C, no man. A, Naaman. What problem did the military commander have? A, he had been stung by a jellyfish. B, he stuttered. C, he had leprosy. C, he had leprosy. How were people with leprosy typically treated? A, isolated and avoided. B, seen as superior to others. C, taken to the hospital and given medicine. A, isolated and avoided. Who came up with the solution for Naaman's problem? A, Naaman's wife. B, a young servant girl. C, the king of Syria. B, a young servant girl. What people group did the servant girl belong to? A, Syria. B, Israel. C, New York. B, Israel. What was the name of the prophet Naaman was sent to for healing? A, oracle. B, the oracle. C, Elisha. C, Elisha. What did Elisha tell Naaman to do to bring healing? A, dip in the Jordan river 7 times. B, climb Mount Everest. C, go show himself to the priest. A, dip in the Jordan River 7 times. True or false? Jesus never had compassion for others, but expects us to have compassion. False. Finish the sticky statement. Compassion is God's love blank. A, for you. B, in action. C, through Jesus Christ. B, in action. That is the end of today's lesson. I hope that you learned something and that you apply it to your life and that you have a safe, great, and blessed week.